To government and budgeting processes, or the presentation will focus more on how this local knowledge can be integrated into formal government planning and the process. Next slide. Yes. So there is a principle on how now we this local knowledge can be recognized into budget planning and processes. The principle for recognition of local knowledge in the planning and the budgeting process refer to uh, acknowledging and valuing the experience, insight, and traditional practices of local communities when formulating development plan and allocating resources. This is very important to synergize the local knowledge and informal planning and budgeting processes in order to make sure that we really tackle the problem that facing the community. So this principle is crucial in ensuring that development intervention are relevant, effective, and sustainable. Next slide. So there are key aspects of the principle on how this local knowledge can be recognized into formal planning and budgeting processes. One is community participation. How now we can use the community to recognize their local knowledges and identify problem on how to solve this problem. So local people should actively participate in identifying the problem, putting the community at the center of the driving seat to identify this problem, setting priority and designing solution that really tackle the problem that facing the community. Their life experience provide context-specific insight that top-down planning might overlook. So to include the community during planning and budgeting process is very important to make sure that we capture all aspects that can solve the real problem. Also, valuing indigenous knowledge, hearing the voice of the community, and then put into planning and budgeting is very important. Traditional practice and local wisdom, such as farming technique, conflict resolution methods, and resources management, should be respected and integrated into formal planning processes. Also, context scientific solution, recognize local knowledge, help avoid one size fits approach. So we can have diverse approaches on how to tackle the problem and lead to interventions that reflect local reality, needs, and opportunities. Next slide. Also, building trust and ownership. If we recognize the local knowledge, we will build trust and ownership. When people see their knowledge respected, reflected in the plan and the budgeting, actually build trust and ownership of the approaches, they are more likely to support and own development initiative, enhancing implementation and sustainability. Of course, most of the project, most of intervention are not sustainable because the community don't own the whole processes. So if we recognize them, their knowledge, practices, technique, of course, they will own the intervention. Also, including inclusive decision making, very important. Inclusive of marginalized group like women, youth, person with disabilities is very important on how to tackle the problem. Of course, we have a real solution on how to tackle it because we actually included to hear their voices, their views, their technique on how to actually tackle the problem. That ensure that diverse local knowledge is harnessed, and that development is equitable. Next slide. So how now we can apply how application in this planning and budgeting process? One is data collection. So we'll capture the local knowledge through data collection using participatory tools like community mapping, focus group discussion, and local storytelling to gather local knowledge. Also, setting priority after listening them, what they say, what are their views, what are the technique to solve the problem. This will ensure community voices help to determine development priorities. Also, after setting priority, next is budget allocation. Allocation of budget, of course, will help to reflect what identified by the community and which will solve the real problem. Allocate fund to initiative identified and supported by the local community. Also, monitoring and evaluation that includes local indicators. Of course, the community, they know how to solve the problem because they are living on that locality. So if we will actually include them, listening them, and evaluating their thought, so we can solve a little problem, of course. Next slide. So that was the general overview on how we can use this local knowledge to solve the problem. So coming to the lens of climate change, using local knowledge to solve climate impact. One is local knowledge as a tool of climate resilience. We know that climate change is a global problem now. So if we use different approaches to solve this global problem, it will be very important to recognize local knowledge as an approach to solve the problem. So one is local knowledge as a tool for climate resilience. Local community, especially indigenous and rural population, possesses generation of knowledge about environment pattern, resources management, and coping mechanism. Recognizing this help design climate smart solution. Of course, the community, they have their method on how to cope with environment, and that knowledge, local knowledge. So if we use that local knowledge to solve the problem, so and if that knowledge will be recognized in the form of planning, of course, we will come up with climate smart solution during design. Also enable the government to respond more precious to local climate impact. Also enhance disaster preparedness response using traditional early warning sign and practices. Next slide. Also, participatory planning and budgeting, including local knowledge, require decentralized and participatory approach. Engaging the community in bottom up planning processes. On this aspect of participatory planning and budgeting, very important to include local knowledge. Of course, it will be easier to capture their thought at the early stage of formal planning. Also will allow to allocate budget line that allows for community priorities, including those informed by local climate observations and adaptation. Of course, if I take the strategic planning for Tanzania, for example, I'm coming from Tanzania. So sometimes if you look on a strategic planning of maybe a certain district, sometimes is climate blind. It doesn't reflect on the impact of climate change. So if we'll use this participatory planning, of course, the community will identify their problem in the context of climate change, and that problem will allow the government technocrats to put into formal budgeting, and that will allow to allocate fund budget line to solve the community priorities. It's also establish community-led climate action committee is very, very important. If we'll have climate-led action committee that stand on behalf of communities, it will be easier for government planner to hear the voice of the community through this climate committee, to inform the government that this problem we can solve with this technique, or we can use this technique to allocate the budget for implementation. Next slide. Bridging science and traditional knowledge, very important, rather than treating local knowledge as a secondary data. As a secondary, government can foster hybrid approaches using scientist approach and the local knowledge approach, putting it together. Of course, the approach can be very effective to blend of course, the problems that facing the community. Budgeting for capacity building workshop where both knowledge system are shared and validated is very important, as well as promoting co-creation of solution, especially in area like agriculture, water management, biodiversity conservation as well. Next slide. Policy and institutional integration. To recognize local knowledge actually should be in policies. So policy must, of course, address local knowledge as well. If we want local knowledge to be recognized in form planning, so we have to institutionalize this local knowledge into planning, into guideline, in order the government to allocate the resources, budget for implementation. So including it in national climate adaptation plans and local development strategy, very important. If we institutionalize this local knowledge, also develop guidelines for integrating traditional knowledge into environmental impact assessment and land use planning. Also, if this local knowledge will be supported with laws that protect indigenous rights, so local knowledge will be integrated into plans and the intellectual property around the traditional knowledge. Next slide. Gender responsive and inclusion framework, very important in recognizing local knowledge. If of course, in 2020 we had a study of water governance. We had two groups of women and men. We were doing water resource mapping, identifying water resource mapping and how is operating. Of course, what we got on that mapping by grouping them. Of course, the women there were they provided a more detailed than a man. So on that context, gender responsive and inclusive framework is very important because you will have access different information on how to tackle the problem. So government process should ensure inclusive representation in planning and decision making. Also, budgeting framework should be gender sensitive. Budgeting framework should not generalize. Generalize. It should be gender sensitive. Recognize that local knowledge is not uniformly distributed, but shaped by laws and experiences. Next slide. In terms of monitoring and evaluation, using local indicators is very important because the community they are living on their locality. They know this season might happen, maybe uh, uh, might have drought or something might happen. Therefore, the government should use local indicators such as changes in flowering seasons, water table shifting, or animal migration pattern as part of climate monitoring framework. Also, in terms of financial and investment, financing and investment, establish climate adaptation fund that are accessible to communities. This notion of how now we can localize climate finance, and this will actually be implemented if we establish climate committee and capacitated into one project management, how to utilize funds, how to apply fund, how to monitor the project, and how to evaluate the project. After having that committee, so we can have this help them to access the fund direct for investment. Of course, currently you can find that there is an organization apply for a fund and then use that fund to implement direct to the community. But putting the mind that the organization should have a learning cost, should of course engage maybe technicians, professionals to implement that project. So if we will capacitate communities uh, to establish the committee, so they will access directly the fund and use that fund to implement or to solve the problem that is existing within them. Also, creating a mechanism for direct financing of community-led climate initiative that reflect local priorities and knowledge. Next slide. Thank you for listening. Asanteni sana in Swahili language. Hello. So so
Thank you, Mr. Charles. We can open the floor for any questions. If there's any question, anyone can write it in the chat box.
Does anyone want to moderate or moderate?
yes, welcome for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Charles. I think there is no questions.
Yes. So if there is no question,
You can conclude the presentation, I think.
okay. So by conclusion that of course sometimes the government have not been considered this is local knowledge. They think that is not fit for solving maybe the problem. So it's now a time as practitioners on the issue of climate change to advocate, to document this local knowledge and share to the government, engage the government to understand this local knowledge and how they can use it to make sure that we have a concrete solution on tackling climate problem, climate impact that are facing the community and the global as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Charles. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Okay, thank you.